Thank you so much, Kieran. Darshan, would you like to give a brief intro?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Arthur, for organizing all of this and really honored to be here. And thank you to everyone for being here. For me, in terms of my personal journey into this work, really starts from being sort of the 9/11 generation. I was about 14 years old, working class in New York City from an immigrant community, undocumented Muslims who, when 9/11 happened, were sort of the first ones to get deported, get put on Muslim registries. And so I grew up in that context and backdrop of losing a lot of our communities. And a lot of that infrastructure, unfortunately, today, which has been expanded fourfold under over three different presidents, is the kind of infrastructure that Muslims for Just Futures was really birthed to change and to abolish and to dismantle and say that our personal experiences, whether within this country or globally, being sort of, victims and survivors of colonialism, white supremacy, that there is something that we can actually offer to collective liberation and collective movements. And that is that there is a infrastructure out there on that's built on Islamophobia, on anti-Muslim racism, on anti-Palestinian racism that has really expanded the global imperialist machine that hurts our communities right here, but also on a global front has been harming communities. And so therefore, as part of a collective liberation front, we really want to say that as Muslim communities, as Muslim abolitionists, we're here to do the work to build power in our own communities, but also to say as part of the broader carceral and criminalization apparatus, that this too must be part of the demands to abolish, and that we cannot compromise on Palestine or the war on terror because of national security. So that's really the crux of our work and what we have been doing really within MJF, and actually how I even met Arthur when we did at CTU back in September, a national convergence around community and economic defense, really going to the point that one of my other fellow co-panelists mentioned about our working class communities of it's community, but it's also economic defense because of the way racial capitalism is operating. So down the line, very happy to share with you all the particular tools that we are developing. But before wanting to get into that, just wanted to be really transparent of where I am coming from and that we've been doing community defense for many, many years, and also why we started centering power building because we want to get out of this condition.
Hey, I really love the way you put that, Darshan. It makes me think of this idea that we can't just play defense forever. That, like you said, we have to build power out of it. And I love thinking about community defense in that way. That it's not just survival, but it's building power towards something different. But to kind of start us off and the rest of the conversation and grounding us in those threats, I think it's important for us to kind of wrestle with a certain contradiction. On the one hand, these threats that we're facing, including the threats that are possibly about to get worse in the coming months and years, they're not actually new, right? A lot of these conditions that our communities are facing, these challenges, these threats they're systemic in nature. I mean, they all are in one way or another. So it's important we don't think that this conversation starts and ends with Donald Trump, because it sure as hell doesn't. On the other hand, it seems that we really are moving towards something unseen. It's the next Trump administration, but it really seems like uncharted territory for this country in many ways. And we don't all have to have the same perspective on exactly what those threats are, which are most likely or most important. But I think we all agree we're moving into a new chapter this year, and there's a lot of uncertainty. And so in the spirit of plurality, I'd like to ask each of the panelists to say with some more specificity, what are the particular threats, the particular uncertainties that are most directly affecting and concerning your own community that you're organizing in? And how is that tied to the organizing strategies that you're developing with your community members, with your comrades on the ground? So some of this may be an expansion on what you've already opened up here. But let's dig a little deeper and let's start again with Che.
Yeah, as a capacity building organization, this is a question I would actually throw back to the, hundred and something people here. I think that, some of the big safety threat themes that I see right now are about threats to organizational safety. So That can be threats coming from the state through like House Bill 9495, which, you know, Muslims for Just Future, y'all have a wonderful toolkit that we've been reading all up and down and through. You know, looking at these legislative attacks that are meant to, of course, target those who are working in Muslim groups and Palestinian groups, or who are in solidarity with a free Palestine. But we see organizational safety threats showing up also, I think, sometimes at the radical right. So noticing an uptick in radical right threats to organizational offices, threats to show up, arson. We're seeing an uptick in digital security threats. I hope that it's not true, but I imagine a lot of folks here have experienced some form of Zoom bombing in the past 6 months. And if you haven't experienced it, then you've heard about it. And then, you know, I think that there are a ton of increased threats to individuals. We have a rapid response system that we offer to organizers. I'll drop the link in the chat in a minute, but in a good week, we probably get something like 10 to 15 organizations reaching out to us through that system with requests for emergency support. As of November 10th, we're seeing anything between 20 to 30 tickets a month from individual organizations. And so that's just us, right? But even in that microcosm, I can see that individual organizers are experiencing increased doxing. And when I say doxing, I mean a bad actor sharing someone's personal information online for the purpose of encouraging harassment against them. We're seeing increase to individual organizers experiencing like random pullover from the cops, right? Or increased surveillance. And then, you know, I'm in Atlanta, and so inside of the movement to stop Cop City, as well as nationwide, because cop cities are now everywhere, we're seeing a really big increase in increased charges for things like vandalism or graffiti, really trying to get folks caught up in these cases that for some folks will take years to resolve. And so it's not just these gigantic RICO cases that we're seeing. It's also these smaller charges, like taking a wheat pasting vandalism charge, trying to elevate it to a felony, and then catching someone up in a case for 2 or 3 years so that they can no longer organize. So what do we do about it, right? All the doom and gloom. I mean, I think one thing that is really important for us to keep remembering is that we can always start fortifying ourselves. There is actually no bad time to fortify our organizations. I have a homie whose sister recently got pulled over by APD. And when they pulled her over, you know, they made up some excuse to grab her phone and to go through her phone. And what did they find in her phone? Well, they found all of these signal threads where organizers are planning actions. And so not only did she get charged because of that pullover, but now we have like a huge movement safety-wide threat. And so I think there are some basic things that we can do to just reduce small vulnerabilities, right? Like reduce the excuse that a cop's gonna make to pull us over. For folks who can, it's like making sure your tags are up to date, making sure you're not driving around dirty, right? For all of us, it's really increasing our rigor around digital security and putting those signal threads on disappearing messages. Come on, y'all, right? It's making sure that we're not sort of getting lax in these moments and really letting there be holes. I think about our movement. What's that? I didn't make this up. Someone brilliant who does disease study made this up. But you know that Swiss cheese metaphor that people use sometimes? But I think about it like Swiss cheese. You know, Swiss cheese, a little piece of it has a bunch of holes in it. And our movement has gaps, like we have safety gaps. And one layer of protection is not enough. There are still going to be holes. But we add another little Swiss cheese slice, and then another, and then another, and each one fills the gaps of the last. And so, I think folks might get critical of Signal and say, Signal actually isn't super values aligned with our left movement. Signal has gaps. Yes, it absolutely does. And that's why we add another layer of protection, right? That's why we have code names. That's why we don't share sensitive information on these threads. That's why they delete. So I think the biggest thing that I would say really is like, let's clean up shop. Let's make sure our organizations have really addressed the gaps that are easy to address so that we can work together on the big stuff. We can build coalition around some of the bigger things, so that we're not wasting capacity on charges that quite frankly could have been avoided. I'll pause there because, I can go on and on.
I love so much of that, and I want to keep following those threads, but I'm going to stop myself. But Kieran, let's hear from you. What threats are you seeing in your community, and what kind of organizing strategies are y'all pursuing?
Yeah, so I think, people are probably aware of like sort of countless threats going on. I was going to take this opportunity to talk about just a couple things that we're working on in terms of uh, defense. One is that in our union, we recently helped organize the first, or I'm sorry, the biggest group of video game workers in the country. They're the people that do the quality assurance for Call of Duty, the big war game. And our local was key to helping organize it, but it's a totally, generationally different group of workers. It's a very young, a lot of like genderqueer folks. It's not. I thought it might be an all boys club working there. It's not. People are plugged in a little differently than my generation is. So like, we would they're very introverted. Some of them, but they're also um, very aware of sort of their dignity and their place in the world, and not sort of just getting run over. So they're a strong group of people, good people to be organizing. Anyways, this is just my background. They also have this company Slack, right, where anybody can say anything, and they have different channels, including stuff for like Star Trek and weightlifting and this kind of stuff. But they have one called Allyship, which is sort of a corporate type of word for like a social justicey type of channel that people can post on. And after the election, there were some people that were kind of venting about Trump being elected and expressing an interest in getting guns and doing it in kind of loosey goosey, undisciplined way. So one of our stewards and one of the long-term organizing people there, a kid who's a farm boy from southern Minnesota, um, but grew up around guns, kind of did a info dump in the way that kind of sometimes that slight autism thing does, where people just want to give you all the facts all at once. And he um, broke down sort of like, what does it mean to purchase a gun safely? What does it mean to train with a gun safely? What does it mean to carry a gun safely? Just broke down all these facts. Didn't threaten anybody. Didn't advocate anything illegal, anything like that. And so Microsoft, which now owns Activision, fired him even though for this. So this is like a kind of attack, but it's a really interesting one, I think. And we're waiting to see if we're going to kind of have to unleash the dogs to fight for his job back, because it deals with both the right to armed self-defense and kind of Second Amendment type of thing. And also it came up in the context of young trans workers talking about feeling scared and wanting to figure out how to be able to defend themselves. So our campaign is going to try and talk about both of these things around that, and we'll see how it goes. I have a feeling it could be a really interesting thing. Keep in mind, this is the company that produces uh, Call of Duty, which is this huge war game. Upset that one of their workers was talking about legal armed self-defense for marginalized people. So that's one thing that I'm thinking about. The other thing is that Black Cat, as part of this coalition we're in, Worker Solidarity Circle, is working on doing a fundraiser for the what I'm kind of calling the reproductive freedom underground in the states that where abortion has been criminalized and made totally illegal. And there is brave groups of women, mainly women, working class women, grassroots people, not from the big nonprofits, who have banded together to and also really internationalists because they're really standing on the shoulders of the Mexican reproductive freedom underground that had built networks while ago and are basically shipping abortion pills to women that need them. Because a lot of people can't afford to find childcare for a couple of days and make a trip to a state far away. And that can be scary as well. So anyway, I don't need to tell you all why that's so important, but there are groups of women doing that, and we're trying to organize labor to give financial support to this because we think it's really important that we sort of demystify people who are defying the law and saying that there's good reasons to defy the law. And when they do, we should have their backs. When they take those risks, we should have their backs. So that's another project we're working on. I think I might be close to my time, but I do also think one kind of particular threat that I'm thinking about, I think we're kind of aware of a bunch of the different kinds of threats that are going to potentially accelerate that are coming from the state. But I'm also really thinking about the divisions within the class or within the people, so to speak, in which there are going to be, fascist type of movements that are not just purely the puppet of Trump or of the government, but are actually built out of our own contradictions in our own communities and how we're going to deal with them. Because I think sort of the liberal anti-fascism, the reliance on, the state and the system to take care of that is not a good winning strategy in the long run. And we have to be able to build sort of movements that are serious about winning some of those people away from fascism, but are also not going to allow them to to hurt people or to damage people or to launch us into a total dog eat dog kind of world.
Thanks so much, Kieran. Darshan, would you like to talk about threats and strategy these days? What's it look like in your community right now?
Ooh, that's a heavy question. I think what Muslims for Just Futures, what we've been doing, and I think now for ever since post October 7th, frankly, in many ways, even before Trump got elected, our communities have been dealing with lawfare, whether it's in the form of, again, the expansion of the national security, surveillance, counterterrorism, Islamophobia apparatus had already been hitting our communities both within for our students, for workers, for the increase of just vigilante violence towards our community members in the form of hate and, hate violence. And so I think even before Donald Trump winning the election, I think for a while we've already been dealing with the brunt of a lot of things in our communities. And I think at the local level, where we really want to focus on is that investment into organizing infrastructure. So within the Muslim community, because of the war on terror apparatus, a lot of infrastructure was taken down within our community. So that is one thing I think all of us know that, there's infrastructure gets built out and the state comes in and destroys a lot of it and, puts people away, and that there is an impact that our folks have to deal with the pain of that and then have to rebuild, and we have to organize in different ways. And so I think we were already trying to do deep level investment into local organizing. So we've been running organizing institutes for the last 5 years. This year, we finally met our 100 mark of training 100 organizers across the country. And now we're excited to do more of a 4-state strategy. So really looking at a deep red state, purple and blue, sort of going into the next 2 years, because in the next year, in 2026, actually, we're going to face the 25th anniversary of the war on terror infrastructure being around for a very long time. So for us, for the first thing we really want to do is the organizing infrastructure that we really want to beef up and support and build up. The second side of this is also the resources, getting the information, and also demystifying some of this policy and legislative and lawfare work that's happening. So a lot of our resources, I'll drop our virtual community defense hub that we have launched. We did a whole analysis of Project 2025 for particularly community and movement groups to say, let's break down what they are saying here, because there's a lot of just information that was around, and in some ways some disinformation around Project 2025. And I think it's important as, organizers and movement folks to be very much precise and exact of what is the threats that we are facing. And so we've offered some of that information out there to our folks to say, have these conversations with community members. So there's a whole guide plus a complimentary conversation guide for your family members. So how do you have a conversation at the dinner table with family? because part of what we've seen in the last 4 years is that the right has also made traction and inroads into our communities of color. So even within Muslim communities, there were some folks who have definitely been peeled off to the right because of queerphobia and homophobia. And so we have to be honest of some of the places where we have to kind of bring our people back and talk about the contradictions, as well as why is there even any kind of resonance that the right has, the multiracial right that we're starting to see. So I think that's important. And two, it's kind of counterintuitive as abolitionist organizers, but we've now also built a small movement lawyering network that is developing tons of know your rights information. So I will drop again our virtual community defense hub, but there are KYRs on there around immigration, around federal prosecutions, around things like the counterterrorism, RICO laws, MST pieces, protesting at just understanding protests. We know that folks are going to take to the streets come January 20th, January 18th, and afterwards. It's a little bit of what I love what Che said of we just want to make sure that we don't end up stepping on landmines, because that was a big mistake we made in the first Trump admin, is that we didn't think about the landmines and we didn't take the threat of the right and how fascist they were seriously. I think there are sometimes folks that have this thing about America as a democracy and that we won't get treated as badly. We have to let a lot of that go. I'm not saying all communities, but sometimes that naivety can be in certain spaces, leftist spaces that we really want to push back on. So we're fortifying with lawyers, know your rights information, deepening our organizing bench to really support, particularly in places where there is not an infrastructure in place. Also, on the movement defense side, we've done a lot of work around HR 9495, which is the nonprofit killer bill. And we're bringing in organizations and people. We believe in people power. So we really say, rather than looking at the glass half empty right now and saying, we don't have money, we don't have more people, how can we take the existing organizations and organizers and build tables and ecosystem spaces? So we actually bring our strengths together and increase our capacity that way. So there's been a lot of work in the last year that we have been doing to hold, working groups across organizations, to build tables, to do convenings, to say, we have a lot of power. Let's bring ourselves together and let's actually expand our capacity by, doubling up and coupling up rather than actually dividing ourselves further.
I love all this so much. I love what you said about building infrastructure at the local level. I think that resonates so deeply with our idea of building power in place. That's at the end of the day, we can't be relying on the state, like Kieran said. Just to pull out some highlights from things that y'all were sharing. Che, I love how you described that we need to fortify ourselves. Kieran, you talked about demystifying defiance. And lastly, Darakshan, I think you really spoke to a contradiction that some people like to avoid, and maybe it's not a contradiction at all anyway, between the idea that the state represents threats to our community, and at the same time we need to understand how to navigate it to keep keep each other's state. Something comes to mind for me is an early training I had when I first became an activist with the Wobblies, and somebody told me the law is not the sword, it's the shield. But like you need all to know how all the tools in the toolbox work if you're going to be strategic, if you're going to be effective, if you're going to protect yourself. So, to move on from this question of specific threats and specific strategies, I'd like to ask for some thoughts on this broader question of community itself. I think on the one hand, it's really wonderful that concepts like mutual aid and community defense and even dual power, a lot of these really powerful revolutionary ideas are becoming more and more popular and accepted. At the same time, sometimes there's a risk maybe for phrases like community defense to become a bit of a buzzword. No, so it's worth kind of checking in and asking ourselves, and I'd like to ask you all about this question of community itself. What do we mean by community defense? Can you defend a community that doesn't exist, right? I mean, a lot of issues that I know I'm seeing in my own community when I talk to activist friends that people are facing is they're realizing that there has been a profound erosion of the social fabric underneath our organizations and institutions and strategies, right? That the basic bonds between people of trust and community are kind of few and far between. It's not a monolith, of course. But I'd like to ask you all how you see the sort of crisis of community itself in this country, recognizing, of course, that society in the United States is not a monolith. It's full of a plurality of communities, and this answer is probably different for all of you. But how do you see this question of the relationships between people in your local community, the cultural bonds, the shared sense of belonging and identity? What is the relationship between this and your organizing strategy itself? Do we not need to strengthen the bonds of community itself in order to be able to build power in these more organized ways? Starting with Che again, how does this resonate with you? And take it where you feel it.
Okay. I think we have to start by really getting clear about what fear does to our physical bodies and to our ability to organize. A lot of people are afraid right now, and I think that fear is a logical response to the safety threats that are likely that we're hearing about, and the barrage of safety threats that we hear that are less likely, but we hear them all the time on social media, in the news, and that does something to our physical form. I think that, one thing that's really important to consider as organizers is that fear constricts. It literally, it moves our blood and our oxygen like in. And it really gears us towards our trauma responses, towards a fight or a flight or a freeze or an appease. It dissociates us. And I think that those trauma responses can be smart. I'm not trying to like shade our trauma responses. There has been some point in our lives where each of us has had to individually navigate harm. And we probably survived in part because of that trauma response, like that flight that got you out of that bad thing, or that fight that got you out of that bad thing. And so I want to offer a little bit of compassion to that, that like, oh, thank you. Thank you, girl, for saving my ass from that really shitty time in 2009. You know what I mean? And like, it's not 2009. And I don't want to respond to every pressure that comes at me like it's 2009. And so as organizers, I just think we have to have a bit of compassion for the ways that fear can organize physical bodies into isolation and away from community. And that will show up in lots of ways, right? I love my comrades so much. And there are times when the group chat gets very overwhelming for me, and I don't want to be in connection with people. I just moved into a new house, and I know I need to go meet my neighbors. I am also so tired. And I don't want to deal with the reality that my neighbors have political differences from me. And so I'm isolating. I haven't met them yet. And I can recognize the sort of disconnect between the fear response and what I care about. I can see that there's a gap there. I love what Kieran said earlier about kind of like, you ain't gotta love everybody you organize with. Like, you ain't gotta be super, super, super politically aligned and connected. I'm kind of paraphrasing, so feel free to correct me if I said it wrong. But I just think that we have organizers who came before us who were very brilliant, who created different kinds of formations for a reason. And I just don't think every coalition is a marriage. And so that's why we have networks, because you ain't got to be like politically aligned with everybody who you're safety planning with, right? Like there are certain ways that we need to be values aligned enough to move together. But I think we have to get really critical, just like in dating, you know what I mean? It's like you go on a first date with somebody, you're trying to like see what they're into, you know, are they nice to people who are serving them? Do they order weird stuff off the menu? And you're trying to assess, like, what are they going to be to you? Is this going to be like a casual situation? Is this going to be marriage? Is this wifey, you know? And you kind of interact with them as such. And I think the same is true for organizations. Like, um, you know, I think sometimes it's late, so I'm just going to be real honest. I think sometimes we get real caught up and we say, like, this group is not abolitionists. I don't want to work with them, right? Like, this group does not completely perfectly align with who I would imagine to be like my movement spouse that I'm going to live a whole lifetime with. And so I don't want to mess with them. And I just think we have to get a little bit more critical about how and when we collaborate and setting boundaries and saying, listen, this organization in my city, they're not abolitionists. And they are very good at safety planning. So we're going to collaborate here, and then we're not going to collaborate here. And we're going to make that really crispy clear and draw a boundary. I think the last thing that I'll say is just, oh, let me share these resources before I forget one more time. The last thing I'll say is just, like, individually, we each need to up our rigor around avoiding unprincipled conflict. I think that our left movement has many people, but we are losing. We have many people. We have more people than our opposition, but we are losing. And I think that in part we are losing because we are not addressing some of the internal fissures and fractures that can make our foundation weak. And some of that is about internal conflict. And so there's stuff we can do at an organizational level. You know, VCW does a whole training series on generative conflict. But I think individually, we each have to say, you know what? I'm not entering unprincipled conflict. And I'm going to address it when I see it immediately. I'm not going to let it fester to the point where I'm now on a safety team and I know certain people don't talk to each other. So I got to, like, carry messages around them. Like, I'm not doing that. I think that there's a level of, like, it's just rigor, right? It's just, like, really upping our own sense of principle to say, we do not have time for this. And we will not engage with avoidance. And we will lovingly call each other in and say, yo, you two need to talk. And you cannot be on our safety team until you talk. Because I think when we do that, like, I just came from an action 2 weeks ago where I saw that. I saw 2 people on a safety team who clearly were not communicating. And so this poor third person was, like, running around them, collecting messages. And the team ended up missing a really important cue. And because of that, there were arrests. And I'm not blaming the team for those arrests, right? That's the cops' fault. But it slowed them down. And you could see it from the outside that they were slower, they were less trusting, they were less impactful because their wild ass communication system. Yeah, I want to pause there. Oh wait, no, I don't. One more thing. I don't imagine this is relevant to y'all, but I just want to say it in case. I don't know how or when being a member in an organization became unsexy. But I just want to say it is sexy, okay? I hope, Kieran, I know y'all got some really fly jackets, and I'm like, how do I get one? Because those things are sexy. And if I gotta, like, phone bank or door knock, whatever I gotta do. But you know what I mean? Like, I think if you are not in an organization and you cannot call yourself a member of an organization, and for me, I'm not talking about VCW. I work at VCW. I'm a member of other organizations in Atlanta. Then that's the first thing, right? Like, full stop. Like, everyone needs to join a group. And if you can't find a group, then you better be making a group, like yesterday. Okay, I'm gonna pause there.
So many thumbs up. Kieran, how is this all resonating with you? What's the role of community, connection, social bonds in your conception and practice of community defense?
Yeah. So I think I am more of glass half full motherfucker when it comes to the community. Like the question, I feel like there is a lot of problems, but I also feel like there is community all around us all the time. I think sometimes, you know, if people have a superficial relationship, with their coworkers or with their neighbors or with their family or with whatever, then it could feel like that kind of atomized thing. So it doesn't come for free or easy. But I think if you show a commitment to people, my experience is that that generally earns you some respect. It'll earn you some enemies too, but it'll earn you some respect. It'll earn you a place. It'll earn you, you know, friends and comrades, or whatever, for lifetimes. So I think there is, but it takes, and I think part of that is about being strategic. If you don't want to just sort of flit around from this to that to the other, but you really want to have some connections, then it takes some commitment, and that should be a strategic choice as much as possible. My job that I've been in now for years, which sucks, um, is came about not strategically, but because I got fired from my other job, and me and my partner had two little kids, and I had to basically find the best job I could right away. It didn't matter what it was, and so it wasn't a strategic choice. But I've also had to kind of like, I came from working UPS. I went into a call center, and so it was a very sort of different mode. Like, it wasn't, it was just different in so many ways. But I've made that my community in many ways for 2 decades, and because of that, and because of the work we've done, we've been able to build real relationships with everybody, and and also have a few enemies in there too, who don't like what I'm about. And so I think part of it is about uh, that commitment, and then having a strategy to do it in a place where you're going to be able to, a place you want to be. There's no sense in sort of making a commitment to go somewhere you don't want to be, but to really like, having that commitment and to be a sort of consistent part of whatever it is, a community, a workplace, or something else, or maybe your ethnic or national identity, or maybe gender identity, or other kinds of subcultures can also be those kinds of identities. And I don't think that they're sometimes, radicals will sneer at subcultures, but I don't think that that's necessarily the case unless those subcultures are sort of, just only looking inward, and not sort of like being willing to connect with other communities that are in struggle. um, so I hope that is a little stab at your question.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Darshan?
Oh my God, I feel like this is one of those questions we could spend hours on. I think for MJF, we really hold that community is in itself the best way to do community defense, because we need one another, especially in the context of state repression. We got to be able to rely and trust each other. And yet MJF was also born because of the fact that community at points has been very harmful and hurtful, particularly within some of the ways that we have faced, in certain Muslim spaces where being who we are, the mosque is not accepting of us. And so I think there are multiple layers to who are we in community with. So obviously we have a membership, right? Our members, our trusted folks, the people we break bread with, the people we have been tested, our relationships. These are 8, 10, 12, 14 years that we have been building with one another. We have seen each other go at different points, right? And so those are folks I am in community with, or we are in community with, and we choose to be in community with, and they choose to be in community with us. And then there is this, in Islam, we call it this concept of the ummah community and there's all these beautiful things of where, the ummah, it's like your entire body. And if one part of your body is in pain, the rest of the body feels pain. And I think one of the reasons when those of us who look at what's happening in Palestine or what's happening to so many folks abroad, I don't personally know any of them, but there is this sense of these are my people and I am hurting and I am in pain. And it might not be definable. It's not something I can like put into like, here's 1, 2, 3, 4. But I do think there is a sense of people do feel connection, even of folks they have never met, on this context of a shared humanity shared, community, something about you is identifying, which is also why I feel so much of where we get state violence, the dehumanization to break the bonds that they are not like us, is such a deep process of it. So I think there's all these different layers of community, of being in community, of this community we can identify with, even with people we never may have met, may not know, but feel like, yeah, those are my people. That's my people, right? For us, we're like, our Muslim community is global on a global scale. And then I think there is a certain vision, a North Star of what we would love to be in community with, of what community could look like. So much of the beautiful visions of abolition is about, I want to live with my people. I don't want to deal with state violence. That's also a dream, a beautiful dream, a lovely dream of love, right? If this is community and we want to be in that kind of world with one another. So I think it's all these different layers that exist, which is why it's such a beautiful and complicated thing. The last thing I will say is, and this is something we, particularly for those of us who identify as Muslim women and also deal with gender-based violence, have had to grapple with, of community can be painful at times, but just because there's harm in our communities or people have perpetuated harm still does not justify state repression and state violence. And I say that because so much of how colonization and particularly Islamophobia and gendered Islamophobia operates is this idea that Muslim men are abusers and therefore state repression is needed to protect and save Muslim women from these Muslim abusers. And I think that that has done so much harm, and we can acknowledge where harm exists, but that never still justifies ever state criminalization or state repression.
Yeah, there really are so many layers to this conversation. Any one of these questions, I feel like we could have a whole discussion about. But for the sake of continuing the momentum, I'd like to take us in a slightly different direction. And that is someplace between inspiration and shortcomings. And what I mean by that, by inspiration, is I'd like to ask all of you to share what movements to you provide the most inspiring examples of community defense at its best, that really inform, inspire what you do today. This could be a historic example. This could be contemporary movements that you draw inspiration from. But at the same time, could you share how you see with that lens where we're at as a movement today, where you're at with the organizing in your own community, and be as real as you're willing to be about those gaps, as I think Che put it earlier. What is the difference between what we know is possible that we draw from our inspiring examples that really get us going, and where we are now? What do we need to do to get there, to build movements that live up to the revolutionary examples that inspire our work today? And just to maybe give a personal example, I lived for a year in Northeast Syria, spending time with the Kurdish freedom movement. And there's a revolution happening there, the Rojava Revolution. And I will never shake the experience and what I saw, of witnessing communities governing themselves. And the fact that that is possible really is something that I'll never be able, it kind of haunts me in everything that I do, but it also keeps me going, because I can never say, oh, well, it's never going to work. And so when I organize in my own neighborhood, I see it through that lens. I think, oh, if we could only get the kind of consciousness and commitment, and the unity that the communities have over there. So starting with Che again, what gives you inspiration, and where are we falling short to live up to that inspiration in our real existing movements today?
Yeah. My ladies behind me, they give me inspiration. I think specifically Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson. I don't think STAR gets enough credit as an organization for some of the blueprints that they created that many of our organizing campaigns are building off of today. I think STAR started in a time when the movement was sort of like in a transition. They started in 1970. SNCC was starting to kind of end. there, I think, was a lot of question about like what happens after, quote, after the civil rights movement. And at the same time, and I'm looking at your question, April, about just sort of like what to do when you are isolated, when you're in a rural community, when you're in a community where there's just like a ton of people who are not about you. And I think Sylvia Rivera has a lot to say about that. Like New York might feel like a haven for trans people now, but as a cis person, I think that what many trans people tell me is that one, it's not, that that's a myth, and that it was even harder in 1970. And that many ways, I think the conditions that trans women of color were dealing with in the 70s are similar to what folks experience in the rural South now, in terms of like lack of resources, being turned away from homeless shelters, being turned away from the food stamp office, being harassed on the streets, zero support from the cops actually busting up the only places that you can go for safety. And so in the midst of that, like huge repression, we have this collective of trans women of color who get together and are like, no, who have already been kicked out of the gay liberation movement because a lot of the gay men, mostly white, were super transphobic and super racist and just didn't want to deal with their stuff and wanted to be respectable enough to be accepted. And so, they start this group where, they're doing a little bit of everything. They're addressing street harassment in the West Village. They are literally like beating up and chasing people down the block who harass their sisters, in heels. They're doing what I think we would call now mutual aid, but that at that time it's just a part of campaign work, right? You take care of your comrades. That's how you can continue the campaign. That's how you can continue organizing. And so they're developing these really sophisticated like housing systems and just ways to make sure that they're good, And I think that I find that so hopeful, because it's a reminder that campaign organizing, base building, community safety, and mutual aid are actually all the same damn thing. And that once upon a time, they didn't have different terms. And that in a strong movement, we do all simultaneously, so that we can feed our organizing work and literally feed our organizers. The other thing that really inspires me about them, this is me kind of editorializing from 2024, but Sylvia was really open to coalition in a way that I think some of us now are not. In 1970, like she was meeting with Huey P. Newton. They were having conversations about what would it look like for the Panthers and Star to have some sort of like coalition or network. What would it look like, right? And this is coming off the tails of SNCC having those same conversations with the Panthers. And I think part of why they imploded. And so, one can imagine what would have happened in our movement if that had come to fruition, right? If we had actually had a truly revolutionary sit-down conversation across working class communities of color, including and centering trans working class people of color inside of this very militant revolutionary moment. Like, it's so exciting to think about. And I think that it didn't happen for a lot of reasons, including COINTELPRO, right? State repression that I think is just very different than what we're experiencing now. Not that we're not experiencing a version of COINTELPRO now, but not the same. But I think that for me, like I have this joke. The name Che was given to me by a mentor whose name was Che. And he told me, when you find someone that you mentor that feels like they can take your place, then you give them this name and then you're done. And I was like, okay. And so I feel really kind of excited for the day where I get to like give this name to another person. And I also think that part of my job between now and then is to continue that dream that Sylvia and Marcia had of really finding coalition between like the Star of today and the Panthers of today. Not just across identity, but really, I think across like units of power, right? Like Star had this super hyper local neighborhood-based collective that address safety in such a way that we're still building models off of what they did in New York. The Panthers were national with very, very, very strong bases in very select chapters. So really different organizing models, but very effective. And I just think there is some synergy around the combination of those two models together, mixed with just the beauty that we get when we listen to trans communities and let them lead our organizing strategy, when we listen to women and femmes and let them lead our organizing strategy. I think there's just magic that happens when we do that. And I feel like, if we carry some of those stories into our movements, stories of hope and stories of like, but what if that had happened? Like that's a sci-fi story right there. I think it allows for us to dream beyond some of the like petty stuff that we're in now and really consider that we're part of a lineage. I will stop there.
So true. Thank you. Kieran, what resonates for you with this question? Where are you at in terms of inspiration and what we got to do to live up to it?
I'm gonna take this time to talk about some stuff from the uprising in Minneapolis because it was the most, sort of profound, um, radical confrontation I've ever seen or been a part of. And it was, I've been doing politics on my own. I came out of a political family, but I've been doing politics on my own without my parents' direction since I was 15. And uh, definitely not in my parents' direction after that point. Um, but but I had never seen anything like the uprising. It was, just deep and profound. And so I was going to tell a few little stories from that because I think they're applicable. One of the things that happened after the third precinct was sacked was that the police withdrew from the city. A third of them quit on the spot so that they could try and complain they had PTSD and get paid off by the city. And the rest of them just went and sat and hid. There were some exceptions where they had teams out there, attacking people in small ways, but the police presence in the city just disappeared. So you can imagine being in the city's about 400,000 people, and all of a sudden there's no cops on the streets anywhere. And it's a trip because like we didn't expect it. This was something different and new. It was both kind of liberating for lots of people, lots and lots of people, and it was a little bit scary, even to people that also felt liberated by it because we hadn't really figured out what's next. And because people are people and they don't just sit around, people started figuring out what to do, what's next. And some of them were building on other projects that they'd had going for some time. But there were mass community meetings in different parks. In the park across the street from where I live, there was a meeting of 200. In a park just one neighborhood over, there was a meeting of 400. And they were discussing community self-defense. And both of those two parks, which were majority white, the attendees, all talked about how the community self-defense had to be anti-racist. Now, I think they had all different kind of views or ideas about what that meant, but it wasn't a right-wing gathering of people talking about sort of, just property protection or whatever. And in some neighborhoods, there were those kinds of meetings that happened that were basically right wing. There were also, and one of the things I did because I think I was figuring out I was 49. I turned 49 the year of the uprising, so I'm no, I had to be more part of the encouragement and advice brigade than sort of an active combatant in the uprising. But I tried to get out there and be around people and help people and learn from what was going on around me. And one thing I figured out was that there was all of these different community self-defense projects had sprung up all across the city and they were different from each other. Some of them were armed, some of them were unarmed, some of them were all African American, some of them were, mostly white. Some of them had sort of a left or revolutionary or radical political ideas. Some of them didn't. Some of them were spontaneous. There was one block where a Somali family because out of the uprising with all the fires and stuff, some of the drug trade had moved around, and one group of drug dealers set up on a one street where there hadn't been before, and started clashing with the neighbors. And one Somali family, kids got threatened by the drug dealers. The mom confronted them. They pulled guns on the mom, so the dad had to get his gun. And then basically he helped organize his block which was a multiracial block of Somali, Latino, Asian, white, African American folks, to set up barricades on both ends of the block, where they defended them with arms. And it initially wasn't an abolitionist project. It was kind of just this immediate sort of like, we're sick of dealing with these cats on our block, who are threatening our families and stuff. But because the police saw it as a hostile project, and the city council saw it as a hostile project, because these neighbors are taking upon themselves to defend their own communities because no one else will. In fact, the Somali dad told me he had called the cops first, and they had drove up to him and told him, well, it's your fault for living in this kind of neighborhood, that he would have to deal with this kind of violence towards his family. So they were in the process of figuring out that, real self-determination and real community self-defense isn't going to happen through the police, and isn't going to happen through the politicians. So that was another example. And I just think, my feeling is that things that happen in Minneapolis are probably going to happen again in different ways, and maybe in bigger ways. And that one of the things we should think about, it seemed almost far-fetched for us to have thought about it before. What happens if there's no cops on the street? Well, in this case, that really was the case. And what does that self-defense look like? Our group at the time, we had a group called Work that did some important work in terms of providing defense to the clinics that were set up kind of around the protests against Third Precinct, which were sometimes attacked by the police, rubber bullets shot into the clinics at one point. And then also organized a cop watch program during the uprising, that was, basically doing, patrols in working class, multiracial neighborhoods. One of the things I did, like I said, because I'm not as much of a sort of frontline fighter as maybe I once was, is that I tried to go around and meet the different community defense groups and find out what their deal was, and also find out if they were interested in figuring out who the other groups were in town, because there wasn't sort of a consciousness that this was happening everywhere. So I think I would say that that's one thing we should look for, is look for formations that are popping up, and try and hook up with them, try and build a relationship of solidarity with them. It doesn't mean you have to agree with them on everything. Definitely all the different groups that popped up in the Twin Cities, a lot of them were on different pages, and some of them ultimately ended up basically selling out, because at a certain point the city decided that in order to get the city under control, they were going to have to co-opt some of that stuff. So that happened too. And I think sort of understanding that this next period is going to mean there's, as well as this kind of a frightening repression, the possibilities of terrible violence, and as we've seen in Palestine, of genocide, that there's also going to be some openings and some possibilities to really transform things, and to try and anticipate as much as possible what that will look like, and what openings will be there, and how we can use them to hold ground instead of having to give it back.
Thanks, Kieran. Darak, what inspires you about the possibilities, and what do you think we got to do to realize that potential?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it really comes to the stories of my great-grandparents and my family. They were part of the Quit India movement, had fought to get rid of the British colonial rule. And there's this one story that, ever since I was a little girl, my grandmother used to share with all of me and my cousins, right? It was like we would hang out. And she shared with us that, my family live on what is now post 47 Indian borders. And they were living in a part that was majority Sikh and Hindu, and they were the minority Muslims in that space. And once they were able to get rid of the British, but we know, unfortunately, the British left a partition behind, which is that they split the borders in a way that created and sort of essentially pulled on a lot of the tensions that were already there. And they had this hope that because they had fought alongside their brothers, whether Sikh or Muslim or Hindu, that this was not going to turn into much more serious. So they were one of the families that stayed behind as people were leaving on the trains to, other parts of the border. And they had a friend of theirs who actually let them harbor in his basement. It was a Sikh friend, 50 family members from literally getting slaughtered and killed. And, towards after a few months, when things got much worse, their friend actually came to them and said, now the other neighbors know that I am keeping Muslims here. And please find a way to leave and go across the border because they are coming to kill you all. And the stories that I remember, sort of our families literally finding a truck somewhere, getting 50 people in that truck, talking about things like, oh, the babies are crying. We may need to actually leave them behind because if they bring attention, all 30 of us could get killed. Giving the young women, including my grandmother, literally poison to say women and girls are being kidnapped and trafficked. So we want to prevent this from you. So I think there's stories of literally fighting alongside for, liberation, but then facing this painful partition to then come to Pakistan, live as refugees, and then down the line, literally start community pharmacies to support folks because healthcare is so expensive. You don't have access to that, become community lawyers who then later on would literally defend folks from cases from police brutality, even run for local governance and build unions. I think they're like decades long struggles to be like movement is something that it's literally a lifetime, but in many ways a multi-generational fight. That these are things that you got to think 5 to 6 years. But one thing I was always inspired by them from is that I never saw bitterness in them. I never saw anger in them. I never saw them regret that they did the work that they did. And they imparted this piece of believe in people, believe in community, fight for justice without this overbearing way. It was sort of just the way that they moved with each other. It was like natural. And the reason I look to that is because I think sometimes now we have commodified organizing, and I'm a professional, right? I get paid to do this work. I fundraise for folks. It's like you got to train. Like it's almost like this separation of like people have to go through all of this to professionalize themselves. And yet here were communities and folks who like naturally just were supporting, were organizers, were building power. And that to me is sort of the vision and the dream of can we build a world where it's just natural? Community defense is natural. Collective care is natural. Mutual aid is natural. We show up for our people is natural. And so I think that's the kind of dream I wish I could go to. And then also the level of power individual people have. Here was their friend and comrade who literally kept them in his basement from safety. We are coming at points where we might need to think about literally folks doing that kind of support for people to say, I'll keep you here because we might be living in neighborhoods and spaces where your physical life is under direct threat. And he was willing to take that risk and also be clear when he was like, I can't anymore. So let me help support you to get you to where you need to go next so that you all are alive. And so that's what gives me hope that it has happened. It's there. And where I think there's a gap is how do we make it as if it is literally just a way of us being with each other, that it doesn't feel like something that we have to do massive trainings and people feel, afraid that there's over there, those are the folks who really know how to do community defense and they're so good at it. But rather, can everybody that we're around has it within them to do this as just a way of us being with each other?
Wow. There's an incredible list of inspiring examples, I think. Just to pull out a few of these examples before moving on. We heard about Sylvia Rivera and Star and the BPP. We heard about the uprising in Minneapolis. We heard about the struggle and unity as well as contradictions within the anti-colonial movement in India. And throughout all these examples, I'm hearing so many common themes. I'm hearing direct action. I'm hearing the power of hyper local organizing at the community level, of people taking the well-being of themselves and their people into their own hands through organizing in all these different contexts. And something that's really striking me is something that Kieran brought up, which is that in 2020, we saw a movement, we saw this in Seattle as well, where in some cases the state withdrew from our communities. And I think before we segue, just to leave an anecdote, like one way I interpret these stories that I'm hearing is that in these moments of acute crisis, when the state does withdraw from our communities, that's when we're really faced with where we're at in our organizing, right? I think, Kieran, the way you put it was like, even though it was liberating to get rid of these repressive forces, it was also a little bit scary because we didn't feel prepared entirely to meet the moment, right? And another way to frame that is like, are our movements prepared to meet a power vacuum? So as we think about the coming months and years ahead and this deepening sort of uncertainty in our society, we'll just leave that as a question, like Darakshan put it. What does it take for us to make it natural so that when those crises happen, our community is already governing itself and taking care for itself? No. We have one more round of questions. And the last question is about place. And what I mean by place is I want to ask you all, what is your organization's relationship to place, right? To the local community? And what do you see as the importance of place in shaping your own organizing strategies and conceptions of community defense? It's not the only way to look at this. At the Municipalism Learning Series, we're a little biased. We think place is really something essential. It's kind of a starting point for community defense. But where does this land with you all? And again, once more, starting with Che.
Yeah, I can tell a quick story. So VCW in 2020 got I think 200 requests for community safety trainings from 200 different organizations in 1 month. And we are a small but mighty team, so that wasn't gonna happen. And this was around the time that the uprisings were starting in Minneapolis. And so, I think, Darakshan, to your question about like, why can't this feel like the natural thing? My answer to that is in part because of how funding structures work. Because there's a grant that's called Healing Justice Grant, and you have to say, I'm a healing justice group only to get the grant. And I think that can sometimes put us in these unnatural topical silos that then make it difficult for us to like put things back together. Anyways, so we're in Minneapolis, supporting some of the groups there around some of the community safety stuff that's coming up around like, yay, the cops left. Oh shit, the cops left, right? Like it's the like, yes, and the, oh shit, we won. Now what? And so in the midst of that, we get 200 training requests, and I feel terrible every time I have to say no to somebody because that's like, they're in it, and I have to say we can't. And so at one point there were a few funders that had asked us to do a series of trainings in Minneapolis because, things were really popping off there and it felt like the important moment. And I feel so grateful for our founder and my homie, Ijaris Dixon, who is a visionary and who has no problem talking back to funders. And Ijaris was like, no, we're not doing that. Because we have 200 organizations who are asking for our support. And so instead, we created what we thought at the time was going to be this one-time security school. And it was national, and we had all of those 200 groups come to this school. And we were like, all right, y'all, we have to train you all at once because we can't train you all individually. It wouldn't make sense. And what I learned from the school that I had no idea would happen is the importance not just of saying no to focusing in one place, but of actually creating a space where groups can connect to each other. I didn't realize at the time that so many folks in Minneapolis and Chicago, right? Like all of these groups were experiencing the same safety threats, but they weren't necessarily talking to each other. And that's not for lack of trying. Y'all were busy. I get it. But there just wasn't dedicated space to actually talk about safety themes. And so one of the beautiful things that I saw come out of security school was, I'm sorry, I'm gonna slow down. I see the interpreter is giving me the eye. What I noticed was that when local groups were able to connect to each other regionally, it created an opportunity to build really strong strategy and to deal with some of the contradictions that were coming up locally. And so my lesson as a capacity builder who does national work is sometimes we have to just get out of the way. Like sometimes we have to just create space for groups to regionally talk and recognize that one safety strategy will not work for the entire nation, right? Like to April's question earlier about like, what about rural folks? Yeah, what about rural folks? The strategies that we use in Atlanta, they are not going to work in Macon, Georgia. And we understand that now. And so when we're able to connect all of the rural people together, and then they can talk about all the ways they build community safety that looks really different than an urban environment, then I think we have something, right? Um, I think the last thing I'll say is just like it's super important for us to remember that security work can look real sexy, you know, it can look real like you get a fly little like vest and sometimes you get a like a Janet Jackson headset and you're out there and whatever. It can look cute. That is not the organizing project. Like that's not going to make us win anything. That security work protects organizing projects and organizers. And I think the more that we can keep bolstering healthy campaigns, healthy organizations through this kind of support work, same with like healing justice work, I think the more clear we're going to be and the closer we're going to be to winning. I'll pause there.
Thank you so much. Kieran, what comes to mind?
So our organization is really aimed at as a priority the workplace, and we see that as a locus of exploitation and oppression, power and leverage for working class people, and one of the places where we potentially have the most power and leverage at times. It's also a place where different parts of the working class have to interact in ways that they might not in their normal, rest of their normal lives, because of segregated communities, because of different divisions, etc. So our vision is that we want to build a network of militants and directly democratic, direct action organization in workplaces across different industries and networked with each other. With the idea being that we'll be able to organize groups of workers that can have each other's backs, that can defend each other, that can come out for each other if somebody gets fired, that if there's a strike, that we can build the kinds of tactics and mass that will be successful in winning demands. And that also that those organizations in some ways also those organizations are tentacles out into the community, because for instance in my workplace, there's people that live in Minneapolis and in St. Paul, but also in all the different working class suburban rings, around the cities. So if there's I remember when stuff jumped off in Brooklyn Park during after the uprising, immediately I looked up which of our members lived there and called them and just reached out to them to see what was going on and what if they needed. Because at that time there was tear gas was thick in the streets and the city was, again, pretty shut down. And for people that hadn't directly experienced Minneapolis, it was maybe a new phenomenon to feel that way. So I think the thing about workplace organization is it's not sort of separated by a big wall from community. It really ties into it, and in some ways it can give you sort of feelers out into lots of different neighborhoods and communities, physical communities. And then I think we want or our perspective is ultimately, and you know, I think we have to start having discussions about this, that where we talk about this in a real way and not just sort of some far off way, but that we ultimately want to take the power away from the ruling class and, you know, redistribute power to the people. And that is going to mean a, you know, a major radical transformation in everything, in the way we relate to each other, the way that, you know, reproduce life, the way that we, you know, are able to feed and clothe and shelter each other. And it's gonna not none of it's gonna come easy. I mean, you can kind of just look at Elon Musk's tweets and know that this motherfucker ain't giving up shit without a fight. And so what we're doing is we're building a defense network that is also capable, you know, ultimately of, you know, going on the offense. And you know, the great Vince Lombardi said the best defense is a good offense. And so I think that's part of what we need to be thinking about too, is how do we press them, you know, so that the exploiters and the oppressors are on the back foot and not always us.
Thanks so much, Dr. Sean. How do you see the role of place in your organizing?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, we've had to do a local and a national strategy that has to be collaborative because the war on terror apparatus is a federal policy. The funding is coming from the federal government, and then that feeds into local law enforcement agencies. And so what we have found is that a local strategy alone is not enough to bolster the local organizers because often what they're up against is a federal sort of apparatus that local policymakers have said that they have absolutely no jurisdiction over and can't even push back on. So we started out very much hyper local and local DC and learned the hard way, especially DC doesn't have statehood, that the particular apparatus that we were really trying to fight at a local level to say we want DC to stop investing in it, to cut its ties to the JTTFs, cut its ties to DHS and ICE and all of these pieces, we were told consistently that the local government officials that they had absolutely zero power over this particular national security apparatus that was really ruled by federal folks. And so what we are saying is that at MJF, our national strategy, which has been about movement building, because we also recognize that we can't do this alone and that this apparatus is not just targeting Muslim communities. It is actually targeting movements at large at this point. And so the whole point of our movement building strategy was to be able to say, hey, there is a bigger united front calling for an end to this than just Muslim communities. But we also recognize that local is hyper important. And so in local, where we are making a heavy investment is in Houston, Texas, is in NOLA, is in Northern Virginia, and then is on North Side Chicago. And so we're kind of saying, let's look at where there are some of the largest populations of Muslim communities, where we have seen, especially in the last few years, a real uptick in the local infrastructure around the war on terror. And so when I say local, just very quickly, what I mean is the presence of things like fusion centers, the presence of things like the Joint Terrorism Task Forces, the presence of the enmeshment of hate violence crime and laws, which now we also see in the form of anti-Semitism laws that are essentially covers for Department of Homeland Security to surveil our movements and communities. What I'm also talking about is things like see something, say something, which just are anytime something happens, we see an uptick of reporting to federal law enforcement agencies. I'm also talking about things like the 1033 program, where any kind of military equipment is then taken to these local law enforcement agencies who then parade it around as toys in local communities. And then there is a vast network of infiltrators and informants, about 15,000 or so, that the FBI puts into a lot of Muslim institutions like masjid, community centers, schools. And so we see this sort of apparatus continue to expand. Anytime there's any kind of a quote unquote terrorist attack, it becomes then the flag for let's expand all of this infrastructure. And so for us, it was important to say, we need a national flank where we have a clear vision of we want to abolish this entire thing. We're not looking to tweak it. We're not looking to reform it. We are saying take that $8+ trillion of investment that the government has done, put it towards other infrastructure, whether you're looking at what's happening in California fires or anything, all of these are infrastructure gaps. if we were investing in actual preparedness, our communities would not be struggling. But we consistently see that even at the local level, the money gets invested into this sort of law enforcement and criminalization apparatus. But we also do need a local piece because a lot of our communities are also grappling and living in real time in local communities where there does need to be a local real time response and an infrastructure where folks can do community defense with each other. They know best what are the coalitions that they need to be building. And it's not really for us to dictate to them. Obviously we have our guidelines, but we're not going to tell them, hey, you shouldn't be working with this person because they don't fit our, piece around whatever, because the sort of landscape looks different across the country. And so people in some ways will need to be tactical in certain localities to work in certain coalitions. And then in other cities and other localities, you might actually have a much more built up organizing infrastructure where you can move with far different type of organization. So really being mindful that the local infrastructure of organizing and movement and coalition building looks varied across the country. But nevertheless, every time we speak to our organizers at the local level, I'm always taken aback at how also similar the war on terror apparatus is in terms of how quickly it replicates itself. And even the agencies are literally the same agencies. The funding streams are the same funding streams. And so we need to have both a local strategy, but a local strategy also connected to a national strategy.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the kind of depth of strategic content there, Darakshan, especially because I think it's easy to oversimplify even our own values and think that because we believe there's a unique depth in and potential in organizing and building power at the local level that we can sort of romanticize that or fetishize that or think that we can do it in a vacuum, right? So what you're saying to me really shows the depth of sophistication that we need to acquire in our understanding of the state itself and how it functions at every level of government, including law enforcement, including governance. And if we're actually going to build an effective counterpower in our own communities, we need to understand what we're up against. So I really appreciate what everybody's sharing here. I think as we move towards the end of the event, we're going to go ahead and segue to questions from the audience, from the folks who have joined us here. We have a Q&A function. I think we have time to take a few, but we're going to try to be on the quicker side with it. I'm going to start with a question from Dawn. And the question is, how does community control of existing institutions play into community defense and safety? The way I'm interpreting this is it's one thing for us to talk about DIY everything and mutual aid, but the state exists for now. And so what is our relationship to it from our base of power in the community? Anybody and everybody on the panel who wants to speak to this, I would say the stack is open and let the spirit move you.
I can kick us off.
Yeah.
I think any serious abolitionist has to be in a conversation and a question about governance and scalability. Because the reality is that if we're saying no prisons, no cops, then we're also asking to rebuild parts of our local, state, and federal government. We're asking to create something different in our governance system. And we can't just go like, that's not on us. We just don't want cop. Like, we have to actually create and propose governance systems. I think that a lot of the left can get scared about scaling up because power can be scary, because we don't want to reproduce systemic systems of power that have harmed us. And so we sort of avoid and like duck. And I think that I have a mentor, Ju Hyun Kang in New York, who is often talking about this, like, don't make yourself small when you can be big. And what she means by that is that, there are some local projects that should always stay local. And then there are some local projects that in order to build power and in order to actually win, they have to scale beyond a neighborhood. They have to scale beyond a state if we're going to actually change our material conditions. And so some of that requires us to have conversations about, how do we want to govern ourselves at a multi-state level? Do we believe that consensus or modified consensus will work at 5,000 members or at 10,000 members? Do we believe in representative democracy when we have 30,000 members, right? And I think these are great questions for us to be in. I think that there isn't one answer. And I think that all of us need to do a little bit more studying so that we're coming to the table with some understanding of governance systems that have worked and haven't worked. I have all kinds of critiques of representative democracies, but I'm also curious about them when a membership base gets above 30,000 people, you know? The other thing that I'll say is, Atlanta is in a really hard place at our local level because of the movement to stop Cop City and all the ways that local government has been working to repress the movement. And, one of the ways that they've worked to repress that is voter suppression, right? Taking this over 100,000 referendum ballots and simply saying, we're not going to count them. We don't care. And I think that that's disheartened a lot of people and really broken a lot of trust in municipalities. But there is a burgeoning conversation because a lot of our city council members are going to be up for re-election soon, and city council is who votes on the referendum, about what it would look like to run a slate at the city council level. And I think that's scary for a lot of people, especially folks who are skeptical of electoral organizing or electoral politics. And to me, it's a really good question that many of us should be in. How can we build power inside of our local government in order to shift some of the policies that are directly impacting our daily lives? Once we get to the federal level, of course, we have a lot more questions, right? But I don't think we have to start there. I think for a lot of us, the question is, what would it look like if the organizing project that you're in right now today won, right? You won your campaign. What happens next? And then what if you suddenly multiplied by 10? Like there's just 10 times more of you. That's the question that I want to offer as like maybe homework back to people, is that's the question you should be researching right now. That's the question you should be bringing to comrades, having as icebreakers. Like that is the co-governance research question of our movement, because otherwise we're going to be scared of winning, like we're going to be scared of getting big, and we can't be scared of getting big. We don't have time for that. And, I think the last thing I'll say is that a lot of what we're trying to avoid, we're already reproducing inside of our collectives and inside of our horizontal leadership structures. And so there is nothing about horizontal structures that means that we cannot be oppressive assholes to each other, right? Like there's nothing about your collective that means that you cannot reproduce the same toxic work relationship that you have to your boss. So I don't want to keep glorifying horizontal structures as the only way for us to be with each other. And I want to get critical about how do we govern big and still stay in alignment with our values.
The group Movement Generation Justice and Ecology Project, if folks are familiar with them at all, they have this great slogan, which is, if we're not prepared to govern, we're not prepared to win. And they're not talking about electoralism, like they're talking about what Chase bring to the table here. Thank you so much. I think maybe for the sake of getting to other questions, we will take another and encourage our other panelists to take a stab at it. I'd like to choose the next question from April. And the question is, I live in a very right-wing city. 80% Republican vote here during the presidential election and one of the highest rates of poverty in the nation. I'm trying to organize to provide health, hygiene, and harm reduction, but we're in physical danger all the time. How do we organize when we only have a handful of boots on the ground and threats in our face? This is coming from Central Illinois, I believe. So, Darakshan or Kieran, what comes to mind for you of balancing these kinds of threats and responsibilities in sort of hostile territory, we'll call it?
I'd give it a stab. I think, like, for one thing, I don't want, I don't want it to come off like I have some magic, bullet to the problem there, the experience there. So I don't want to act like there's easy solutions. I just talk about some experience though that may or may not be helpful. But one thing, when I was a teenager, we organized a project that became a international network called Anti-Racist Action, which was a direct action youth group that basically fought against white supremacists mainly, and also bridged out from there. And we had a slogan, "We go where they go," which meant that, we weren't going to cede anything to the fascists. We weren't going to cede small towns and, white communities to the fascists. We weren't going to cede, the courthouse steps to the fascists. We weren't going to cede anything to them, the streets, ever. So what that meant was that we traveled to small towns where the Klan, for instance, was holding rallies. We would meet a lot of the anti-racist people that lived there, or that were upset about the Klan being there, and then a lot of that, some ARA chapters would come out of that. That also sometimes would came from people, bands traveling through and stuff like that. So I think one of the big things is to have connections around your region and your community, so that when you're a small group in your town, every other weekend you're traveling to a different part of the region to meet with people like you in that other city, so that you're able to build a community and a network of solidarity with each other. And then I think, being again strategic about what projects you do. If it's impossible to do anything to resist without facing, physical threat. I mean, there's no shame in also looking for other places to be. I know that's not a long-term solution, but I mean, that's obviously, a possibility. But the other thing then is being able to figure out, well, if we can't function without being able to defend ourselves, then that has to become the priority, is organizing to be able to defend yourselves to do things. And that is, there's a whole bunch of stuff you can read and people you can talk to about what that would look like, in terms of, physical training, but and security stuff about, getting doxxed and stuff. But I think, the main thing I learned, my family got doxxed by fascists not too long ago. They put some stickers of ovens. This was a few years ago, on our house, and just clearly indicated they knew where we lived and that kind of thing. And, I said, one thing we talked about is that, I've got a dog, I've got a gun, but more important than either of that is we've got a lot of friends. And really your security and your safety is going to be about who's got your back. And that won't come just from sort of like a sort of two-dimensional political flyering people, but it comes from building real relationships with people. And again, you want to be in a place where you want to build relationships with people. If that's not where you're at now, then find a place where you do want to be. But I also want to say that I think we need to give props to people who are organizing in those right-wing turf, and that do face, a kind of physical threat in a regular place, and are also trying to be and to kind of role model that to other people in their communities. So I think people that can stay and can fight deserve as much support as we can give them from those of us that live in bigger cities.
Thank you so much, Kieran. I think we're going to take just one more, and Darakshan, I'd love to turn to you for it. Lastly, the question is from Geechee, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that, and I'm going to slightly abbreviate it. The question is, can you speak more to the quote, "You don't have to like everyone you organize with," um, aspect? I feel oftentimes it is convoluted and at times helps absolve those who create or contribute to unprincipled conflict. I don't see how functional this is for people who claim to be in work that they hope will yield deep social transformation. So hoping I can maintain the spirit of the question, just to slightly rephrase an additional way, like, in your work, I heard you speak eloquently to this at the MJF conference itself about the need for coalition building. How do you find that line where you can collaborate with people with divergent ideology or conceptions of strategy, on the other hand, while maintaining your own kind of red lines around basic values and the goals you're working towards in the first place? How do you navigate that contradiction?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. I do think for me, my core people, the people I really do deep strategy work, are people I need to have good relationships with and are in alignment, because that trust building to me is essential. We can't move. But I have a two-tier thing, right? Where it's like my core people are my core people. And there I get to set boundaries. I get to say who I want to work with. And also they get to set their boundary and be like, D, like we are going to work, we're going to form this, create this, all the work that I've done. These are folks that I have deep relationships with. But that doesn't mean that, for example, if we are doing a huge coalition sign on, that it just needs to be the three orgs that I'm constantly working with. On those moments, we have gone far broader and said, do you agree with us on this? Because this united front actually will be in the benefit of all of us. So I do think that you need to figure out if you're doing that work. And I think we sometimes do it without naming it, is that you have your core and your core can remain small. I don't think this idea that it has to be huge in scale. I actually think a lot of times the core for everybody is quite small, but our networks can be quite vast in terms of when we're ready to do some kind of a public sign-on, right? Or a public show or a public campaign where we're putting pressure on electeds. There are times where there are certain groups that are better positioned than a group like MJF to get a meeting with somebody who is in office. We don't have that kind of a strength, right? So I also think here you have to figure out what is strategic in terms of the way you're going to build with folks and how they can bolster the vision of work that you do. The other thing around organizations that I've found is that sometimes maybe the issue you have is with the way the bigger org moves, but the staff are really lovely and that the staff are just trying to do what they can do. And they're like, look, I'm here. And so you can also find really good people at certain spaces that you're like, I really trust you. I want to work with you. Because at the end of the day, trust is also built with individuals. It's not always going to be at an org level. And we know that we're also very quite small communities. So you're going to see the same people in different roles over time. And then I also think we don't have to be conflict averse. I think we can be real with each other and say, and I've done that, I've had side conversations with folks in bigger orgs and said, hey, what you did right there, that was really hurtful. That really broke my trust. But I don't think it's strategic for us as, two Muslim orgs to be beefing with each other and to literally never work together. So I want to be honest with you about this actually hurt me. Maybe we can figure out some repair. Maybe we figure out some clarity in communication, but I want to be honest with you that I don't think that it's going to be strategic if we as a small ecosystem start beefing with each other and never want to work. Because there's literally like what, a couple of us, and now if the 8 of us don't want to talk to each other, like come on now. So at some point it's also a bit of your self-maturity too. And again, I've had to grow over years. There was a time where I was like, never working with you, I'm out, I'm this. But now I'm just like, no, a little bit more of the like, what is it that's really bothering me here? And also sometimes trying to understand where the other person or the other org was coming from. And maybe I didn't understand that there are some risks that they could be facing. So it's a bit of also sometimes some collective assessments that you have to make about we want to make a broader front. We don't want to lose our essence, but what could we do to also big a bigger tent so that more people could feel safer? I also think as organizers, we have to do that, where because of risk and state repression, sometimes the language I might want to use around being revolutionary for some of my uncles and aunties in the community, that's not going to work. They're not going to feel safe. So I'm going to have to tone it down. I might not even call it organizing. I might just call it a community chai social, like just come together. But I know that what I'm trying to do there is to get this other information out. So I do think that we have to do it. It's part of what organizing and coalition building is, but you can always create these spaces where you can be honest with yourself of who do you really trust, but that should not prevent us from being able to still move together, even with people that, sometimes you just don't like somebody, they don't like you. doesn't mean we still can't be in meetings together, or, we can't sign on to each other. But I should be clear with myself that maybe I should not be on a safety team with this person because this is not going to work well. So there's also being honest with you too about yourself. So much of this work at the end of the day is about us being reflective of ourselves, because if you can do that, then how you show up, that energy also translates into spaces.
Thank you so much. And more broadly, thank you so much to all of our amazing panelists today. I just want to raise my hands to all three of you. I think you've given us all a lot to chew on moving forward. For me personally, it's really resonated with a lot of questions I've been wrestling in my own neighborhood organizing. And I hope this is the case for others. I think what we were hoping to come into this event was to, if nothing else, get us all thinking about the right questions rather than thinking that we were going to come up with all of the right answers. And I really appreciate everything that the three of you have brought to that while grounding it in real context and practice of organizing in your own communities. A few highlights that come to mind for me, if not answers, kind of like mantras moving forward, that community itself is safety, is the source of safety in our communities, that the safest community is an organized community, right? And that organizing ourselves for self-determination, for self-governance is inseparable from safety. Like Che was saying, these things are not these isolated elements of social life that exist in vacuums. Ultimately, our journey towards self-determination is a journey that comes along necessarily with this question of safety. That being said, we, as the Municipalism Learning Series, we are really just getting our journey started for the year. This is the first event of 2025 in the series, but we're going to keep it going. We're going to do quarterly events, and the next event is going to be in the spring on the topic of base building. So moving throughout the year, we're going to talk next about base building, about the kind of nuts and bolts, the theory and practice of bringing everyday people together in your neighborhoods, in your small towns. What does it mean to empower each other, to sort of directly participate in the process of shaping your own community? We're going to move on from there. We're going to have an event about assembly democracy. What does it mean to create organizational vehicles for direct democracy, for participatory democracy, in which everyday people can come together and actually have a voice in a way that they don't in the state? And our last event is tentatively planned for the topic of dual power, kind of this bigger picture conversation about what does it mean to think really long term at the scale of your hometown about transforming power and governance at the local level from where we are now on a journey to where we want to be, the kind of community we want to live in. So I'm sure throughout that journey, we're also going to be more in the getting to the right questions rather than having all of the answers placed. But we've learned tonight already how nourishing and kind of thought-provoking that can be in and of itself. So again, I want to thank all the panelists. I want to thank all of the attendees. Apologies to the folks who asked thoughtful questions that we did not have time to get to. Feel free to reach out to us and hit us up at municipalism.org if you want to chat more about these topics. Be sure to follow us on social media, to sign up for our mailing list. I think our friends are going to dump some links in the chat here for those purposes. Also, keep in mind, like we said at the top, we have a toolkit. It looks like this, with some beautiful artwork to go along with it. It's called Building Power in Place, Municipalist Strategies, Municipalist Organizing Toolkit. And throughout the year, in addition to these panel discussions, we're also exploring creative ways to create more opportunities for dialogue, to produce more creative content in different ways, to kind of keep this going as a living conversation. There's a link that we have, I want to make sure is dropped in the chat here for our next panel. It's going to be in the spring, and the date is not set yet, but you can still RSVP. So I'm going to go ahead and share it here just to make sure. But without further ado, I want to say solidarity forever. Thank you all. Be safe. Yeah, be well. And we'll see you at the next one. Get out there and organize.